In the delicate light, gentle just before dawn, the medieval village begins to stir. The cold breath of the earth rises in misty wisps from the thatched rooftops and the damp soil. Bird sparrows and starlings flutter in the hedgerows and get in touch without heralding the begin of one other day. It isn't a morning that starts off valved with urgency, but one who effortlessly insists consistent, unrelenting, shaped by the needs of the soil and the sky. For the peasant, there is not any luxurious of time. The day's work begins with the sun, and it most likely ends with its atmosphere. The medieval peasant, quite often regarded as the spine of feudal society, was once born into a global governed, no longer through individual ambition or monetary gain, but by survival, land, and obligation. Most peasants were serfs-bound, not to a master in title alone, but to a section of land. They belonged to the manor, a self-sustaining estate controlled via a regional lord, and their lives had been shaped with the aid of this relationship. Every day commenced with the demands of the manor, and the rhythms of existence have been dictated now, not by means of clocks. However, through seasons, harvests, and holy days, the residents, humble partitions, sturdy hearts, Napshut a peasant's dwelling, a modest hut of wattle and daub, its partitions a combination of mud, straw, and animal dung, strengthened by woven picket strips. The roof, sloped and thatched with bundles of reeds, was once both shelter and chance it stored the rain out when maintained. However, it was once a fireplace hazard in the course of dry seasons. Within, the gap used to be cramped and smoky, with no chimney and handest, a small hole within the roof to let out the soot-laden air. A single room generally housed in whole household, frequently several generations together, with a number of chickens or a pig for warmth and enterprise. A relevant fireside served as the guts of the home, offering both heat and a location to cook. Furnishings were scarce. Maybe a crude wooden table, stools, and straw mattresses unfold across the dust floor. It was an existence without privateness or extravagance, however rich in the intimacy that comes from shared complication. In this space, as the first guidelines of daybreak filtered through wood shutters or oiled parchment windows, the family came to existence. The peasant spouse rose early to have a tendency the fireplace, stir the embers, and prepare a rough meal of potager, thick stew of grains, veggies, and might be a scrap of salted meat. Kids woke huddled underneath woolen cloaks, eyes heavy with sleep, limbs sore from the day prior to this as chores. The primary steps into the fields after a hurried breakfast. The person of the condo would shoulder his picket plowshare or sickle and head out into the open fields. The landscape around the village used to be divided according to the open subject process. The placeland was once no longer enclosed through fences, however, alternatively shared, communally. Each and every loved ones had narrow strips scattered across exceptional fields, some planted with barley, others with wheat, oats, or rye. However, before he could or inclined to his possessed plants, a peasant owed his corvée, his labor obligation, to the lord of the manor. This could imply serving to harvest the lord's fields, repair roads, or collect firewood from the manor woodland. It was once unpaid and regularly hard. However, refusal was once now not an option. The lord's bailiff or reeve of self-discipline kept a detailed watch and had authority to levy fines or worse. The peasant's arms had been most commonly blistered, his back forever bent. The work used to be grueling, yet he moved with a practiced rhythm. Over time, toil grew to be instinct. He understood the land, the best way it changed with rain or drought, the way it responded to manure or relaxation. He could read the sky like a booklet, predict climate with the aid of the path of the wind, and knew which birdsong signaled the coming frost. Ladies' labor, unseen but relentless at the same time men toiled in the fields. Females' work used to be no less taxing. After getting ready the morning meal, a peasant girl could spin wool, brew ale, mend garb, or incline to the kitchen garden, or milk the cow if the loved ones was once fortunate adequate to possess one. She additionally cared for the youngsters, taught them songs and prayers, and offered them early to the tasks they'd at some point inherit. Ladies performed a crucial role in meals preparation. Bread was baked in communal ovens, requiring dough to be ready in advance. Dairy merchandise, butter, curds were made at dwelling and cautiously preserved. Herbal remedy, handed down by means of generations, was once administered to sick kids or getting older mother and father. These women have been mothers, medical professionals, cooks, and employees crucial to the village's survival, although hardly ever mentioned via identify within the written files of the time. Midday relaxation and ritual round midday. A small wreck was once observed. It was no longer leisure in the today's sense, but a essential pause. The peasant could return, dwelling for bread, cheese, and a drink of ale. Water used to be mainly dangerous, so ale weak in alcohol, but safer used to be the day-to-day drink of all a long time. This pause was once also spiritual. The church bells, if the village had a chapel or nearby monastery, rang out throughout. The fields the peasant crossed himself, whispered a prayer, and possibly offered thanks no longer for wealth, but for rain, for excellent plants, for surviving one other day. Christianity permeated all aspects of peasant existence, delivering each alleviation and constraint. The church taught humility and obedience, framing suffering as a course to salvation. Lifestyles on earth was once difficult, they stated, however heaven would reward the faithful. Children of the soil kids were a part of the team of workers from an early age. Via 7, most had been contributing in actual methods, gathering eggs, fetching water, guarding the household's few sheep. There used to be little formal education unless a nearby monastery furnished it. As an alternative, advantage were passed down through imitation. A son watched his father plow, realized too, sharpened tools, and understood which weed could kill a crop. A daughter mimicked her mother, learned when to plant leeks and onions, find out how to make linen from flax, methods to mend a cloak. There used to be also play. Medieval kids made simple toys from wooden, played tag and ball games, and sang songs. They weren't resistant to laughter or pleasure. However, theirs was once a joy tempered by using the looming shadow of disease, famine, and accident. Many would now not, are living past childhood, and those who did bore the reminiscence of loss in their eyes. Evening shadows and quiet fieresas. The sun dipped low on the horizon. The fields glowed gold, and the tools had been laid apart. The peasant, again dwelling, sore and hungry. The evening meal was modest, probably more pottage, dark rye bread, a little of lard or smoked fish. Meals had been shared in silence or with hushed conversation concerning the day's work. News from the village, or rumors of bandits or plague. Evening used to be additionally a time for reports. Around the fire, older villagers could tell testimonies of saints and miracles, of haunted woods and noble knights, of far-off cities and sinful kings. These oral traditions have been the glue of reminiscence and tradition, linking one iteration to the following. By using nightfall, the hut was dark store. For the flickering hearth, there were no street lamps, no synthetic lights. Handus, the moon, the stars, and the occasional glow from a neighbor's window. The village settled into stillness. Puppies barked at foxes, owls referred to as from the bushes, and wind creaked through the eaves. The load of responsibility is major to appreciate that the medieval peasant was not free in the ultra-modern feel. He might now not transfer to another village without permission. He paid rent in the form of vegetation or labor. He was area to the Lord's justice and the church's expectations. But within these confines, he discovered meaning. The village was once his world, a web of kinship, ritual, reminiscence, and survival. Despite centuries of romanticization or dismissal, the life of a medieval peasant was once rich in culture, resilience, and quiet strength. It was once now not a lifetime of laziness or lack of awareness, but considered one of profound patience. It was once not readily the land that shaped the lifetime of a peasant. It was the constitution wrapped around it, a great, invisible net that certain each person in a chain of obligation and energy. To realize a peasant's everyday existence, one have to step back and look on the world he inhabited, no longer only along with his arms, however, inside his situation within the grand hierarchy known as feudalism. The feudal method was greater than a political mannequin. It was once a tradition, a worldview. It used to be a tapestry stitched together by using loyalty, land, responsibility, and tradition. Every thread mattered, from the king on his faraway throne to the humblest plowman tending his muddy strips of wheat. Every body had a situation, and every body, from richest to poorest, owed whatever to anyone else. The lord and the landed, the coronary heart of this method, was once land. Land was once wealth. Land was vigor, but few owned it outright. Instead, the king believed to rule, by way of divine proper granted parcels of land to his nobles, the barons and lords, in alternate for navy service. These nobles, in turn, divided that land additional and granted it to their own vassals. At the base of this pyramid have been the peasants, men and females who didn't own land, however labored it for others, in return for safety, refuge, and the right to survive. The usual peasant did not comprehend the king's name. The king was once a distant, virtually mythical figure, but the lord of the manor was actual and reward, with authority over every aspect of village life. He probably a knight who had earned his property by means of valor in fight, or a nobleman born to privilege. Either way, he lived aside from the peasants in a manor residence or fortified hallland represented the face of vigor within the day-to-day lives of individuals who served below him. To the peasant, the lord was once choose, master, protector, and landlord rolled into one. He controlled the land, the justice approach, and even the rhythms of the calendar. His word was legislation. The manor, a world inside itself. The medieval manor used to be no longer just apartment. It used to be an economic and social microcosm. Inside its bounds lay the whole thing needed for survival: farmland, woodland, meadows, rivers, mills, workshops, and typically a church. Some manors were small, encompassing just a few acres and a cluster of houses. Others had been massive, stretching over a number of villages and using enormous quantities. The manor operated on a smooth balance between the lord and his peasants, and the whole divided into free peasants, villeins, and serfs. Free peasants paid higher for his or her land and had extra mobility. They might more commonly go away the manor in the event that they wished, although few did. Villeins were tied to the land in additional restrictive approaches. They'd extra tasks and might not leave the manor without the lord's permission. Serfs have been certain most tightly. They weren't slaves, for they might now not be bought or sold in my view, but they were hooked up to the land if the land converted fingers. They went with it. Despite their variations, these peasants shared one factor in original. They owed their labor and loyalty to the lord of the manor. Tasks in Ducey Chesant household held a couple of strips of land, slim plots scattered across different fields. In return, they had been expected to pay feudal dues. These dues got here in many types: corvée labor, unpaid work accomplished on the lord's land. In most cases a few days per week for the duration of planting or harvest seasons. Hire in type, a component to their crops, eggs, cheese, or cattle was owed to the lord. Expenses, for utilizing the mill, the bakery, the wine press, or the forest. Nothing got here without fee. Marriage taxes. If a serf's daughter married anybody from outside the manor, a cost was once owed. Harriet, upon a peasant's death, the high-quality animal or possession was commonly claimed through the lord as inheritance tax. These dues have been accrued most of the time, and records had been kept in manor rolls, overseen with the aid of the reeve, a peasant appointed with the aid of the community, and the bailiff, who represented the lord's pursuits, justice, and manipulate. The manorial court used to be the principal legal physique for the peasants. Minor offences, like letting cattle stray, stealing wood, or brewing bad nice ale were punished with fines, enforced labor, or lack of privileges. Extra-critical crimes may be handed to bigger courts. However, for most of existence's issues, the manor courtroom used to be the ultimate word. The court docket used to be additionally a place of group. Instances have been by and large resolved with the aid of jury, a bunch of fellow peasants, based on nearby customized and oral lifestyle. Justice was swift, and whilst oftentimes harsh, it used to be familiar. It reminded every person of their situation and the penalties of overstepping it. Punishments varied. A man who refused to work his corvée, probably publicly shamed, or have his land taken away. A girl who gossiped too freely, perhaps positioned within the stocks. It was once a world the place obedience was expected, and deviation was once costly. Safeguard and dependency. Why, one would ask, did peasants tolerate this procedure? Why endure such worry and subservience? Considering feudalism supplied defense in a hazardous world, bandits roamed the woods. Overseas raiders attacked coastal villages. Famine and plague swept across regions. The manor used to be not just a jail, it was a look-after. The lord had armed guys. He had walls. He had grain shops, and authority to discount with neighboring lords. In times of warfare, the manor might emerge as a fortress. In instances of starvation, it would ration meals. The approach could have been unfair. Nevertheless, it was once secure, and for a peasant, reliability was beneficial. The church, a parallel figure. Even as the Lord governed the land, the church governed the soul. Priests, monks, and bishops shaped a different community of vigor, and peasants were just as beholden to this method as they were to the feudal one. Tithes 10% of each peasant's sales were owed to the church. In exchange, the church offered spiritual salvation, administered sacraments, taught obedience, and reinforced the concept that one's station in lifestyles used to be divinely ordained. A peasant used to be advised, "Your struggling in the world can be rewarded in heaven." It used to be a message that soothed and subdued. The church supplied hope, whilst it accumulated from the poorest pockets. Monasteries, then again, most likely served as centers of finding out, charity, and medicine. A ill peasant would search cure from a monk. A starving one would beg bread at the gates. Yet even here, hierarchy reigned. Feasts, galas, and the glimpse of escape there have been transient escapes from this weight of obligation. Feast days, saints' fairs, and galas introduced joy and color to the dull routine. Music, dancing, pageantry, and trade modified the village for a time. Jugglers carried out, retailers bought international cloth, clergymen preached grand sermons, children played without chores, fans met in secret corners, and in many instances, the king's infantrymen would cross through the village, or a bard would sing of cities a ways away, or knights on campaign. And in these moments, a peasant could surprise what lay past the fields and forests. Would lifestyles be one of a kind? Could destiny be converted? Some tried to flee fleeing to cities, hoping to hide for a year and a day, after which they could declare freedom. Others joined wandering bands, or became outlaws in the woods. But for many, the manor used to be the sector, and regardless of the burdens, they stayed. Conclusion: a system woven in blood and bread, the feudal approach was now not imposed in a single day. It evolved over centuries, born from conquest and necessity, stitched together by means of war, famine, and faith. It was once now not reasonable, it was once now not free, but it functioned. For the peasant, it was each a burden and a process that gave and took, covered and punished. Inside its confines, existence was once difficult, however understandable. The land gave food, the church gave, which means the Lord gave structure. And so, each day, the peasant labored not with uprising, however with resignation, now not with ambition, however with endurance. In the excellent computer of medieval life, the peasant used to be a cog, small, principal, overpassed. Without him, the fields would go unplowed, the bread unbaked, the dominion unfed. But in the eyes of history, he was once not forgotten. He used to be the silent majority, the invisible pillar, the soil from which all kingdoms grew. To realize the lifetime of a medieval peasant, one must think now not in weeks or months, however in seasons. Time was no longer marked by calendar pages or clock fingers. It was measured in plowing and planting, in developing and harvesting, in cold winds and thawing soil. Each season carried its possessed rhythm, its possessed needs, and its own dangers. The success or failure of a single harvest would mean the difference between lifestyles and hunger, just for one family, but for the entire village. In this chapter, we comply with the medieval peasant through the entire flip of the year, starting not in January, but in March, when the earth stirred after its iciness sleep, and the peasant, back to the fields with hope and warning in equal measure. Spring breaking the winter's grippers, the sun rose prior, and the air grew softer. Spring introduced its arrival now, not with occasion, however with labor. After months of bitter cold, smoky huts, and dwindling meals, retailers, the peasant's first notion in spring was once not of magnificence, but of survival. The plough was introduced from its resting situation. If a loved one's owned oxen, they might harness them and begin to show the soil. If now not, the man of the condominium and his neighbors would pull the heavy wooden plough themselves, dragging it by way of the cold, wet earth. Ploughing used to be now not a one-day job. The fields had to be grew to become completely too organized for seed, and stones or particles gathered by using iciness frosts had to be cleared by using hand. The open area approach meant that each and every peasant's land used to be divided into narrow strips scattered across significant communal fields. One strip probably for barley, one other for wheat, an additional left fallow to get well its strength. This process preserved fertility, but required cooperation. No peasant would plant or harvest independently. The group moved as one, like a satisfactory living organism. After ploughing got here, harrowing, breaking apart huge clods of earth and sowing. Barley and oats were planted in spring, together with pulses and beans. The peasants scattered seeds, by way of hand, then protected them frivolously with soil. There were no machines, no fertilizers past manure. Success trusted experience, instinct, and luck. Within the kitchen garden, ladies planted leeks, onions, peas, garlic, cabbage, and herbs. These small plots had been most important. They brought taste to dull stews and vitamin to simple diets. Chickens scratched among the rows, and kids were taught early to weed and water. Spring was also the season of lambing and calving. If a family owned livestock, the beginning of a healthy lamb or calf was once a moment of joy and relief. Every animal was once a residing treasure, a future source of milk, meat, leather, or manure. But spring used to be additionally dangerous. Food stores from the prior 12 months have been practically long past. This was once the hungry hole, when the historical harvest was exhausted, and the brand new one now not but begun. Malnutrition loomed. Disease spread without problems. In the damp air, for many peasants, spring was once not a time of renewal. It used to be the experiment of whether they would live on to look a different summer season. The long days of endless work went, the days lengthened, and the fields turned green. The percent of lifestyles quickened. Summer season in the medieval village used to be relentless. From dawn to nightfall, the peasant was in motion, chasing time. Weeding grew to become a daily venture. Left unchecked, weeds might choke out priceless vegetation. Children were sent into the fields to tug nettles, thistles, and sofa grass. Females inspected the kitchen gardens. Men walked the grain fields, watching for signs of rot or infestation. The peasant also tended to livestock. Cows and sheep have been pushed to pasture. Fences had been repaired. Tools were sharpened. The village millstone groaned below the weight of grain from early harvests of rye or barley. Ale used to be brewed from the primary malt. Bot meadows were mown in early summertime to furnish hay for Icenia's feed. This was grueling work. Scythes were swung in long arcs. The cut grass used to be raked, turned, and dried. Then it was once bundled and saved in lofts or barns. A poorly dried haystack could rot or capture fire, destroying months of work. June and July had been also months of vigil. The vegetation had been sown. Now they had to develop, and any chance in excessive amount of rain, to little sunstorms, hail, ailment would undo everything. The peasant watched the skies like a priest reads omens. A cloudless morning might bring pleasure or fear of drought. A sudden storm might flood fields or flatten the wheat. But there used to be magnificence. At the present time, the world was once stuffed with color-wild flowers, golden grain, blue skies. At night, fireflies danced above the meadows. On Sundays or feast days, peasants gathered within the churchyard, sang songs, drank ale, and advised studies. Kids ran barefoot. Young fanatics met in secret. Though the labor was once heavy, the village pulsed with existence. Autumn, the harvest Rushotum, was once the crucible of the peasant year. The whole lot hinged on the harvest. The work used to be intense, pressing. Sacred. The grain harvest on the whole in late August or early September was once a communal affair. Each hand was wanted. Men, ladies, youngsters, even the elderly. Using sickles, the peasants cut the ripened wheat or barley stalk. By using stalk, the grain was once bound in sheaves, left to dry, then gathered into stooks, and subsequently threshed. Threshing separated the grain from the chaff. Flails, 2 wooden sticks, joined by using leather-based, had been used to beat the sheaves, except the kernels loosened. Then got here winnowing. The place the grain was once tossed into the air so the wind could carry away the husks. It was dusty, tiring work. It left the body sore and the lungs filled with straw. The grain was then saved in boxes or jars, guarded with care. This used to be the food that would preserve the household via wintry weather, and it was once the tax base for dues to the Lord and Church. Some grain was once set aside for planting subsequent year, some for milling into flour, and a few if the family was lucky for brewing ale. Other autumn tasks incorporated: apple, identifying and retaining, slaughtering animals for iciness, always salted, smoked, or dried, gathering nuts, mushrooms, and berries from the forest, repairing roofs and tools earlier than the snow arrived. The harvest was additionally a time of get-together. Many villages held a harvest feast, simple, however joyous. Bread was once damaged, ale flowed, songs were sung. It was a moment of thanks to God, to the land, and to each other. However, there was once no illusion of safeguard. If the harvest was once terrible, the temper became grim. If it failed absolutely, it supposed famine. The peasant might do everything proper and nonetheless lose to destiny. A single dangerous harvest could ripple through years main to hunger, dying, and even rebellion. Iciness, bloodless, darkness, and ready when the final leaves fell and frost lined the ground. The village grew to become inward. Wintry weather used to be not a time of rest. It was once an experiment of education. The times have been brief. Darkness came early and lingered. Fields lay fallow underneath a blanket of snow or frost. Peasants huddled indoors, conserving warmth and resources. The fireplace was once saved, burning low. Every ember mattered. Foods grew to be less difficult. The final of the onions, beans, and grains have been cautiously rationed. Meat, if any, was once sparing. Bread was comprised of stored flour. Some years, flour used to be mixed with ground acorns or bark to stretch to provide. Children had been most likely ill. Coughs echoed through the huts. Blankets were few. If one member of the household caught influenza or fever, others quickly adopted. Monks and priests typically brought herbal remedies or furnished prayers. But treatments had been rare. But even in iciness, work endured. Spinning wool and weaving, mending garments and footwear, carving tools or sharpening blades, feeding livestock, and breaking ice for water. Journeying the church, where candles glowed in the darkness. The iciness months additionally introduced the feast of Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas, moments of sacred pleasure. The priest could lead a procession by way of the snow, blessing properties. Youngsters sang carols. A single candle in the window grew to become a logo of hope. Still, the wintry weather was lengthy, and his food dwindled and bones ached. The peasant counted the times until the first indicators of spring, unless the soil softened all over again, and the pleasant wheel became once more. Conclusion. The 12 months in the life, the peasant didn't reside by way of months or dates. He lived by frost and thaw, by sprouts and sheaves, through light and shadow. The agricultural year used to be no longer quite simply a backdrop, was once the heartbeat of his existence. The whole thing depended on the land, his meals, his wellness, his responsibility, his religion. There was once no retirement, no trip, but there used to be continuity, a deep potential, handed from father to son, from mother to daughter. There used to be resilience, the force to undergo bloodless winters, failed vegetation, and the cruelty of danger. And there was once hope, the hope that the following 12 months can be better, that the rains are available in time, that the wheat would stand tall, that the Lord's taxes can be lighter, that the kids would reside. The medieval peasant lived by way of the land, worked by its rhythms, and rested by means of its grace. The YR was his teacher, his tyrant, and his companion. Once we imagine the life of a medieval peasant, we by and large see them in fields ploughing, planting, or harvesting below the open sky. But for each hour in the fields, there was an extra spent closer to home. Inside of their huts, at their hearths, peasants lived a domestic existence shaped with the aid of poverty, practicality, and a deep-rooted connection to household and way of life. This chapter steps inside the medieval peasant's house via its crooked doorways and smoky air to discover an international now not of grandeur or relief, however of resilience, resourcefulness, and ritual. Right here, loved ones' bonds have been forged, foods had been shared, and the hearth that cooked food additionally warmed hearts. The peasant's dwelling, shelter from the arena, typical peasant house in medieval Europe, was a simple one-room structure, developed no longer for magnificence, however for perform. It was fabricated from wattle and dobber, woven lattice of wooden strips plastered with a combo of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. The roof was once thatched with dried reeds or straw, offering insulation in wintry weather and relative coolness. In summer, although it required time-honored renovation to hinder leaks, rot, and infestation, these homes were small, normally no bigger than 20 or 30 square meters, with dirt floors, few furnishings, and minimal windows. If a window existed, It was a slim slit blanketed with shutters or oiled parchment alternatively than glass. Light, accordingly, got here from the fire or, every so often, a tallow candle. The interior partitions were mainly dark with smoke, for most properties lacked chimneys. A valuable hearth burned continually, its smoke escaping by way of a hole in the roof or venting slowly by way of the thatch. It used to be here that food used to be prepared. Gentle was once furnished, warmth was once maintained, and households gathered during the long winter nights. Family structure. The loved ones of many armsé medieval peasant loved ones typically consisted of a nuclear family, though in times of necessity, accelerated loved ones' grandparents, uncles, widowed sisters, or orphaned nephews could share the space. Area was tight. However, necessity bred acceptance. Children have been considered foremost contributors, no longer simply dependents. From a young age, oftentimes as early as 5, they helped fetch water, are likely to animals, gather firewood, weed the garden, and support within the guidance of meals. Childhood was once temporary. Lifestyles demanded early maturity. Marriage was once each a social obligation and a financial association. Peasants married young generally in their late young adults, and unions have been situated much less on romance and extra on utility. A wife was once a partner in survival. A husband provided bodily labor and defense. Collectively, they aimed to raise children who would in the future work beside them within the fields. In some areas, specifically among serfs, marriage required the lord's permission, and marrying external the manor might set off a price often called merchet. Even on this intimate selection, the hand of feudal responsibility rested closely. The fireplace, core of the dwelling. Fireplace was the symbolic and literal coronary heart of the peasant residence. It used to be used for cooking, heating, drying herbs or meat, and in some circumstances, mild ironworking or device repair. Peasants cooked using iron pots or cauldrons, suspended over the fire through chains, or set beside scorching coals. Foods have been hardly ever various, however deeply sustaining. The most fashioned dish was once pottage, a thick stew produced from grains like barley or oats. Vegetables, leeks, onions, turnips, beans, herbs, and sometimes just a little of meat or lard. Pottage simmered for hours, with ingredients added as available, making a dish that advanced during the week. Bread was a staple. In wealthier villages, or during excellent harvests, it used to be made with rye or wheat. In poorer areas or lean years, bread perhaps blended with peas, acorns, and even bark flour. The dough was once taken to a communal oven or the lord's bakehouse. The place peasants paid a rate to bake their loaves. Meals was once served in wooden bowls or trenchers flat. Portions of stale bread used as plates. Consuming utensils were minimal. Knives were shared, and spoons were customary. Forks were nearly unknown in peasant houses. Until centuries later, ale was once the daily drink for adults and children alike. Water was most likely detrimental as a result of infection, so peasants brewed vulnerable ale from barley and herbs. Greater ales had been reserved for feast days or sold at markets. Slumbering and furnishings, alleviation in simplicity. There were no separate bedrooms. Every person slept within the equal room, mostly on straw mattresses filled with hay, bracken, or wool, laid straight on the ground or on low wood structures. In wintry weather, families huddled together beneath coarse wool blankets for warmness. Livestock, specifically useful ones like pigs or chickens, have been commonly brought indoors at night for safeguard from thieves or wolves, adding warmth, but additionally mess and noise. Furniture was sparse, perhaps a desk, a couple of stools, and storage chests made from rough-hewn wooden pegs in the wall held cloaks or tools. Cabinets displayed clay or wood dishes. The whole thing was once handmade, repaired time and again, and used unless it fell apart. There was once no privacy. Lifestyles was communal. Intimacy, arguments, prayers, and dying all unfolded within the equal small space. For a modern viewer, it might appear crowded or chaotic, but to the medieval peasant, it was quite simply life. The backyard and outbuildings, extensions of the dwelling hooked up to the house, used to be a small yard or garden, in general enclosed with a low wattle fence. Here, herbs have been grown: parsley, sage, thyme, dill, hardy vegetables like cabbage, beans, garlic, and onions. Chickens pecked via the soil. A pig might be tethered to a post. Tools had been leaned towards the wall or stored in a crude shed. If space allowed, there was a latrine pit neighborhood, mostly shared among several families. Waste was used as manure. Nothing was wasted in peasant lifestyles. Water got here from a local stream, village well, or rain assortment. It needed to be fetched day to day, as a rule by using the females or older kids, and carried in buckets on shoulders or yokes. Some homes included a loft or attic for storing grain, herbs, or smoked meat. But most households lived hand-to-mouth. Their wealth, such as it used to be, lay of their cattle, instruments, and potential to work the land. Faith in the house religion was ever. Though the village church was once the middle of religious existence, many peasants practiced their faith every day at home. A small picket cross or painted snapshot of a saint would cling near the fireside. Prayers had been spoken earlier than meals and earlier than sleep. Kids realized to move themselves, to worry hell, and to revere the Virgin Mary. Superstition and folk perception additionally flourished. Herbs had been burned to push back evil spirits. Amulets had been hung above the doorway. If a baby fell unwell, the mummy could pray to a saint one day and seek advice from a local wise lady. The church coexisted with older pagan traditions repeatedly uneasily. Entertainment and storytelling. The peasant's existence was once rough. It used to be no longer joyless. Within the evenings, after the day's work was once accomplished and the fireplace burned low, households gathered to sing, inform stories, or play simple video games. Youngsters carved toys from wooden. Adults recited testimonies of knights, saints, or tricksters. Oral lifestyle preserved folklore, nearby history, and morality testimonies. Tune used to be part of everyday life. Easy flutes, bone pipes, and stringed instruments have been performed. Songs had been shared whilst spinning wool, brewing ale, or, in the course of the rare moments of leisure, feast days and holy days supplied brief respite. Households wore their quality tunics, shared further food if that they had it, and attended mass together. These moments of get-together broke the monotony and gave rhythm to the year. Hardships and resilience. Home life was once not without battle. Illness might strike at any time. Child mortality used to be high. Many households misplaced several children before they reached adulthood. A nasty wintry weather could convey frostbite, starvation, or isolation. Fires have been a regular risk, as have been outbreaks of lice, fleas, and vermin. But the peasant house was once additionally a place of exotic resilience. It was right here that generations were raised, knowledge was passed on, and lives have been lived with quiet dignity. In a world of scarcity, the peasant loved ones discovered to make do, to adapt, and to hope. Conclusion: the fireplace and the hearth. The medieval peasant's residence was not high-priced. It was now not spacious or good lit. Nevertheless, it was alive with voices, chores, laughter, prayer, and endurance. Right here, peasants rested from the fields, shared what little they had, and developed their lives around one an extra. The fireplace that crackled on the middle of the hut used to be more than heat. It was continuity, community, and bravenness. In every pot of pottage, each handmade stool, each whispered bedtime prayer, we discover the heart of peasant existence, now not in wealth or grandeur, however, in the day-to-day acts of survival, love, and connection. If the adult life of a medieval peasant was once a dance of duty, hustle, and survival, then childhood used to be its preparation, a brief window of innocence that swiftly narrowed into labor and accountability. In our modern world, childhood is typically included, improved, and idealized. But for a peasant child within the middle a while, the idea of childhood as a targeted, carefree phase used to be mostly unknown. This chapter follows the lifetime of peasant youngsters, no longer most effective how they were born and raised, but how they worked, played, discovered, and found their place within the harsh, gorgeous rhythm of medieval life. Birth and early years. A precarious opening, arrival of a new little one in a medieval peasant residence was both a blessing and a hazard. Delivery took situation now not in hospitals, however, in the smoky, crowded house of the dwelling, as a rule attended by way of female household or a nearby midwife. Unskilled village lady who used natural capabilities and subculture handed down by way of generations. The hazards were real. Child mortality used to be tragically customary. Without abilities of hygiene, safe birthing practices, or brand new medication, Many mums died in childbirth, and many newborns didn't live to tell the tale their first weeks. It's estimated that in some components of medieval Europe, 1 in 3 kids died earlier than the age of 5. Yet when a child did live to tell the tale, it was greeted with deep joy. The infant was once, as a rule, baptized inside days a ritual, so primary that, if a baby gave the impression prone to die shortly after delivery, a midwife would participate in an emergency baptism herself. This was a non-secular preserve. Baptism washed away original sin and assured entrance into heaven. Newborns were swaddled tightly, wrapped in linen cloths to hold their limbs straight and to shield them from the bloodless. The mum nursed when she could, but when she could not, one other lady, possibly a neighbor or relative, could take over. There have been no cribs, child toys, or changing tables. A peasant child started out lifestyles surrounded by means of fireplace smoke, rough blankets, chickens, and the earthy scent of soil. From the starting, they were immersed on this planet of adults, finding out by way of imitation. There used to be no formal early childhood schooling for peasants. Wealthy children probably tutored in Latin and arithmetic, but peasant kids discovered by means of statement, repetition, and guide from mother and father or elders. From the second they might stroll, they were given small duties: kindling, feeding hens, deciding upon weeds. Youngsters weren't viewed fragile. They had been visible as small adults in training, anticipated to enhance strength, obedience, and persistence. Their education used to be sensible. Boys learned to tie knots, sharpen blades, herd animals, and control a plow. Girls discovered to cook dinner, spin wool, lift water, and tend to more youthful siblings. As they aged, children absorbed the oral traditions of their tradition folk stories, songs, prayers, superstitions, and seasonal talents. A boy might know the signs of an excellent harvest before he could write his possessed name. A woman would respect the remedy homes of a dozen herbs earlier than she had ever visible a e-book. There was once best satisfaction in competence. A 10-year historic who might lead an oxen crew, bake bread, or support repair a roof was now not seen as a baby anymore, but as an asset to the family's survival. Schooling and the trial. Most peasant youngsters did not attend formal college. The church performed a principal position in general guideline. The neighborhood parish priest or a nearby monastery would train youngsters to recite prayers, memorize psalms, or appreciate letters from the Latin alphabet. Education used to be first and essential. Religious children realized to pass themselves, repeat the Lord's Prayer, and discover the liturgical calendar, Christmas, Easter, Lent, and the many feast days of saints. The church taught them morality, obedience, humility, endurance, and the fear of hell. Some youngsters who showed promise, notably boys, probably chosen to become a member of a monastery or serve as clerks, finding out to read and write more fluently. For women, educational opportunities have been rarer. A girl could gain knowledge of to read only if she was once destined for a nunnery, an individual but revered route. Most peasant ladies were anticipated to be trained domestic potential, marry young, and undergo kids of their own. A few urban areas noticed the upward push of cathedral schools and later grammar colleges, but these had been commonly reserved for sons of merchants, nobles, or skilled craftsmen. For the enormous majority of rural children, literacy remained out of attain, yet illiteracy did not imply lack of awareness. Peasant kids were astute observers of nature, of human persona, of craft. Their intelligence was honed by means of necessity, and sharpened by using tough living, work, and accountability, which the aid of the age of 7 or 8. Most children were given actual responsibilities. Boys had been dispatched into the fields with their fathers. They helped sow seeds, weed crops, chase off birds, or fetch instruments. In the course of harvest time, they helped carry sheaves of wheat or spread hay to dry. Women stayed nearly residents, helping their mothers in cooking, spinning, weaving, and childcare. They discovered to make pottage, to churn butter, to curl flax into thread, and to fix torn clothing. Youngsters also labored in the village, serving to a neighbor with firewood, walking errands, or guarding animals while they grazed. In the course of feast days, they participated in processions, carrying candles or singing hymns. Work used to be seasonal. In summertime, they rose before dawn. In iciness, they helped with chores, indoors repairing tools, spinning yarn, or shelling beans by means of FIRELIGHT. The transition from baby to grown-up was once gradual and unceremonious. There have been no birthday parties, no coming-of-age galas. A boy possibly considered a person the day he held a plough without aid. A lady became a lady when she might hold a residence, strolling, or used to be competent to marry in many instances. Through the age of 12 or 13. Play, creativeness, and joy, and yet despite the harsh niskids did play. They made toys from wood, bone, or material, carved animals, dolls filled with straw, balls fabricated from stitched, leather-based, or pigs' bladder. They performed tag, conceal, and search, and simple ball games. They skipped stones, climbed bushes, and raced in the mud. In the absence of structured undertaking, creativeness ruled. Storytelling was an predominant, a part of childhood. Around the fireside, they heard memories of dragons, saints, wooded area spirits, and heroes. These reports formed their figuring out of the sector and taught values, courage, cleverness, charity, and warning. On feast days and festivals, children saw wonders, jugglers, acrobats, dancing bears, brightly colored ribbons and masks. They drank watered-down ale, ate honey cakes, and watched older youths play Morris dancers or compete in archery contests. For all of the labor and loss, there were moments of laughter and awe. Health problem, loss of life, and resilience. Childhood used to be fragile. Disease, damage, and famine have been consistent threats. A simple contamination would emerge as deadly. Accidents with hearth or cattle have been long established. Many children died without ever realizing the wider world. But for individuals who survived, they carried with them a durability and resourcefulness that was difficult to shake. Peasant youngsters had been taught to receive demise as part of life. They attended the funerals of siblings, helped dig graves, and recited prayers for the departed. Grief was once no longer hidden, it was persisted, and when tragedy struck, the neighborhood mourned collectively. Neighbors brought meals, midwives comforted grieving mothers. The village priest pointed out heaven and resurrection. Even in sorrow, there was once team spirit. Conclusion, formed by using earth and hearth. A peasant youngster in the core ages was formed by means of earth and fireplace. The earth of the fields they worked, and the fire of the fireside that warmed them at night. They discovered with the aid of doing, grew by using, surviving, and matured speedily. Their toys had been few, their days had been long, however their minds had been sharp. They lived without luxurious, however no longer without marvel, in a global that left little room for sentiment. The bonds of loved ones and tradition ran deep. The love between mother or father and baby was shown now not in phrases, however in labor, in sacrifice, in the passing down of competencies and reviews, although history seldom names them. The youngsters of the medieval village were the seeds of future generations, silent witnesses to famine and harvest, to worry and joy, and in their laughter and labor, we hear the quiet heartbeat of a society grounded in the simplest, most enduring force of all, lifestyles carrying on with a head. To a medieval peasant, lifestyles was not just shaped with the aid of the seasons or ruled by way of their lord, it was permeated, overshadowed, and in general defined by means of religion. Faith was once not restrained to churches or holy days. It was once a regular presence, woven into each moment of waking lifestyles. God, saints, angels, and demons had been as real as the wind and the harvest. Miracles had been possible. Hell was close, and salvation used to be the highest hope. But alongside formal Christianity lived something older and extra mysterious. Superstition, old beliefs, whispers of the historical gods, folk magic, and rituals handed down through generations survived within the shadows, clinging to corners where the church's mild did not entirely reach. In this chapter, we step into the spiritual world of the medieval peasant, world of rosaries and relics, charms and curses, prayer and worry. Right here, we find now not contradictions, but a problematic tapestry of belief, both sacred and strange. The all-encompassing church in the medieval village. The church used to be the core of community life. Its stone partitions rose above the thatched roofs of peasant huts, and its bell marked the passing of time, the advent of feast days, and the summons to prayer. Most peasants have been illiterate, and the Bible used to be not written of their tongue, but the church spoke to them, by way of ritual, symbol, and rhythm. Mass was once conducted in Latin, However, the message used to be conveyed by way of portraits, gestures, incense, music, and architecture. Stained glass, home windows informed the reports of Christ and the saints. Artwork warned of damnation and promised salvation. The nearby parish priest was once a figure of non-secular authority. Though regularly no wealthier than the peasants he served, he performed baptisms, weddings, funerals, and confessions. He reminded villagers of their sins and their responsibilities. He heard their fears and offered absolution. For a cost, the peasants' 12 months was once structured across the calendar: Introduction, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and countless saints' days. These holy days brought rest from labor, specific meals, and group gatherings. For the devout and even for the weary, these fairs had been welcome interruptions in a difficult existence. Prayer, pilgrimage, and penance prayer used to be a everyday act, spoken before foods, before sleep, and before unsafe tasks. A mother could whisper a prayer as her baby fell unwell. A plowman might mutter one before surrendering his blade to the earth. Peasants stored rosary strings of beads to count Hail Marys and war crosses, or relics believed to ward off evil. Holy water was sprinkled on fields, on doorways, and on ill youngsters. The presence of God was once in all places, sometimes comforting, normally terrifying. When faced with health problem, dangerous harvests, or loss of life, some peasants undertook pilgrimages to holy sites. A journey to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury or St. James at Compostela used to be regarded an act of deep religion and penance. Along the best way, they would lift tokens, scallop shells, badges, or picket staffs, marking them as pilgrims. For those who could no longer journey, donations to the church, public confessions, or acts of self-denial served as penance. Many feared purgatory, a place of temporary suffering after demise, and sought to minimize their time there through prayer, excellent deeds, and indulgences. Saints, miracles, and the invisible warfare to a peasant. Saints had been protectors, helpers, and intermediaries. They prayed to Saint Sebastian towards plague, Saint Anthony for lost items, Saint Isidore for bountiful harvests, and Saint Brigid for safeguard of farm animals. Every village commonly had a client saint, and their feast day grew to become a nearby holiday. Kids were named after saints. Icons and small statues crammed the church, and many properties had painted depictions of favorite saints. Closed the fireplace. Reports of miracles had been normal and believed without query. A blind man healed at a shrine, a good that never ran dry, a statue of the Virgin that wept real tears. Such stories furnished hope in a global of uncertainty. However, there used to be additionally worry. Demons, witches, and the Satan were ever award threats. The medieval worldview saw lifestyles as a battlefield between just right and evil, angels and devils. A sudden storm, a demise, cow, or a failed crop would be interpreted as a punishment from God or the work of a curse. To shield themselves, peasants use now not best prayer. However, people, remedies, and talismans overlapping the divine with the paranormal. Folks' notion and superstition. The ancient methods linger below, and beside legit church teachings, older beliefs quietly continued. The church condemned these practices as superstition or heresy. But for the peasant, they had been simply part of day-to-day life. Some peasants wore charms carved from bone, wooden, or stone, believed to repel evil spirits or deliver good fortune. Others buried nails or herbs at the edges of fields to guard crops, or tied ribbons in timber to please spirits of nature. Witches, though no longer yet the obsession they'd emerge as in later centuries, have been feared. A lady who lived alone, talked to animals, or brewed unusual teas might be avoided or sought out for aid. The road between shrewd girl and witch was once thin. The moon's phases, bird flight patterns, and desires have been interpreted as omens. People avoided going for walks under designated trees or visiting at night for worry of ghosts. When a little one fell ill, some believed it had been taken by using fairies and changed with a changeling. Therapies integrated burning herbs, chanting spells, or reversing garb to confuse the spirits. Even the church typically absorbed these traditions. Pagan fairs were rebranded as Christian vacations. Sacred wells, as soon as choices to nature gods, grew to be shrines to saints. On this strange and shifting religious landscape, Peasant faith used to be a fusion of worry, religion, and folklore. Dying, and the afterlife within, the intellect of the medieval peasant, demise used to be ever near. Life expectancy was once short. Plague, battle, accident, or famine would declare anyone at any time. Accordingly, preparing for death was once no longer morbid, it was quintessential. Most peasants believed firmly in heaven, hell, and purgatory. The dying have been anointed, with the aid of the priest, given final rites, and advised to confess. Families prayed for the lifeless, and paid the church to say masses on their behalf, to velocity their soul's passage through purgatory. Burial was once sacred. The lifeless have been laid in consecrated floor. Close the church if feasible. Easy. Graves had been marked with wooden crosses or stones. The Day of the Useless, in early November, was once a time to don't forget and pray for lost souls. However, folk practices still clung. Some villages placed stones in the mouths of the dead to keep spirits silent. Others tied limbs or positioned iron nails in coffins to keep stressed souls from returning. Worry, manage, and relief. Religion was once now not simplest personal. It used to be a device of social manipulate. The church taught that kings ruled through God's will, and that peasants have got to take delivery of their station and lifestyles with humility. Rebellion was sin. Poverty was once a trial. Obedience used to be virtue. This message was reinforced in every sermon, each stained glass window, each church fresco of hell's torments, sinners boiled in cauldrons, demons dragging souls into fireplace. These snapshots were not metaphors, they had been actual warnings to the peasant mind. And yet, religion additionally brought relief. In a life full of difficulty, faith provided meaning. Struggling used to be not random, it had intent. Heaven awaited people who persisted faithfully. Saints listened, God noticed, and death, though feared, used to be not the top. For every portrait of hell, there was certainly one of paradise. For every stern priest, there used to be a compassionate one. For each thunderstorm blamed on demons, there was a rainbow seen as God's promise. Conclusion: a existence lived between heaven and earth. Medieval peasant walked via life, with eyes forged each to the sky, and the soil working the earth, with one hand and clutching a rosary within the other. Their religion used to be no longer summary theology. It used to be real, lived, and felt. It defined the unexplainable. It calmed fears. It justified suffering. And it connected them to a larger world of angels and devils, of saints and sinners, of heaven above and hell under. In churches and in forests, in prayers and in potions, in chants and in charms, we see the soul of medieval peasant existence, a soul each humble and hungry, trembling and trusting, struggling to appreciate an international a ways higher than the fields they plowed. Within the grinding rhythm of toil and hassle, medieval peasant lifestyles used to be hardly ever effortless, but it surely was, once now not without pleasure. Amid the backbreaking work and the ever-gift hazard of hunger or health problem, there got here vivid spots on the calendar, moments of get-together, shared laughter, tune, dance, and prayer. These have been the feasts, festivals, and holy days, the temporary, cherished days when the plough stood still and the village pulsed with color and sound. The medieval peasant, although bad, used to be not joyless. Their calendar was once punctuated with over 80 religious feast days, just about a quarter of the year, and in between got here seasonal galas, weddings, harvest fairs, and customs rooted in historical pre-Christian instances. These routines gave constitution to the year, remedy to the soul, and a deep sense of communal belonging. On this chapter, we leave the fields and step into the song, thriller, and merriment of the medieval peasants' celebrations. The liturgical calendar, time outlined via faith. The medieval year was headquartered now, not around secular vacations, but across the church's calendar. For a peasant, each season was once framed with the aid of holy days events that told the story of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. Christmas died, opening on December 25th. Christmas was once one of the vital, cherished holy days, although a long way, much less commercial than in these days. It used to be a time of warmth and reverence. The church celebrated the birth of Christ with a midnight mass, candles, and hymns. Villagers decorated with holly and evergreen, symbols of existence amid winter's dying. If food used to be available, this used to be a time for unique treats, roasted meats, fruit puddings, and sweetened ale. The 12 days of Christmas, ending with Epiphany on January 6th, marked a time of leisure from labor, and, in some circumstances, wild get-together. Lords would host feasts for his or her tenants, and villagers would opt for a lord of misrule, a mock king to supervise revelry and role reversals. The place peasants dressed as nobles and chaos briefly replaced order. Easter, probably the most sacred Christian social gathering, Easter marked Christ's resurrection. It adopted the lengthy, somber season of Lent, a time of fasting and reflection. On Easter Sunday, the church overflowed with candles, white vegetation, and joyous song. Villagers wore their quality tunics, bells rang out. Some communities celebrated with plays, symbolic processions, or video games. After the austerity of Lent, Easter introduced feasting eggs, cheese, butter, and meat lower back to the table. The fast used to be broken with pleasure and gratitude. Feast days of saints throughout the 12 months. Individual saints had their own feast days. Some had been minor, others fundamental. These saints had been the guardians of the village's well-being, climate, crops, or animals. St. George's Day, April 23rd, for example, was once celebrated with pageants and parades. St. John's Day, June 24th, featured bonfires, dancing, and midsummer customs. These feast days were not non-compulsory. Peasants were expected to leisure from work, attend mass, and honor the day. However, in addition, they offered rare possibilities for tune, dancing, storytelling, and courtship. Seasonal galas, echoes of the earth beyond church-sanctioned holy days. The medieval village preserved seasonal galas, a few of which had roots in historic pagan customs that the church had, over time, tailored. May Just Day, May 1st, or May Just Day, used to be occasion of spring's arrival and fertility. Villagers decorated with flora, danced around the maypole, and crowned a May Just Queen. Young folks sang and played video games. Couples disappeared into the woods, a practice later frowned upon via church authorities, who noticed it as too indulgent. Good Day was once a social gathering of existence, development, and capabilities, nature's renewal after winter's grip. Harvest pageant, Lemess, or autumn equinox, after the final sheaf of grain was once cut, villagers held a harvest get-together. This might be Lemess, August 1st, when the first loaf from the brand new crop used to be baked and blessed, or a nearby subculture tied to the completion of reaping. The harvest competition worried shared ingredients, Thanksgiving prayers, and simple folks' rituals, just like the creation of corn dollies, symbolic figures created from the last stalks of wheat, representing the spirit of the grain. Midsummer's Eve, celebrated around June 23rd, the eve of St. John the Baptist's feast. Midsummer involved bonfires, dancing, and magical beliefs. It used to be mentioned that herbs gathered on Midsummer's Eve had additional treatment, vigor, and that this used to be the night when the veil between worlds used to be thinnest. It was once a time of affection, charms, fertility rites, and dreams that might foretell the future. Village galas, commerce meets carnival beyond the devout and seasonal observances. Peasants also appeared ahead to fairs, quite often held at most important devout feast days or beneath the sponsorship of a nearby abbey or noble. A reasonable changed a quiet village, inexperienced, into a hubbub of recreation. Merchants arrived with material, pots, tools, spices, toys, and trinkets. Jugglers, musicians, and dancers carried out within the streets. Farmers bartered farm animals. Kids gaped at acrobats and bear-baiting. Ale flowed freely. Food stalls served roast meat, pies, and sweet cakes. For the peasant, festivals were infrequent probabilities to buy goods no longer to be had within the village, promote surplus from their garden or loom, see the external world, if only for a day. Meet strangers from distant towns, rejoice with neighbors in shared joy. Courtship normally blossomed at fairs, with younger folks dancing or changing gifts. Songs were sung. Fights once in a while broke out. However, for a lot of, a fair was once the highlight of the year, a style of color and chaos amid activities. Weddings, baptisms, and village celebrations, sapped from formal feast days. Peasants marked predominant life activities with private party, on the whole involving the entire village. Weddings, peasant weddings, weren't lavish. However, they had been communal. After a church ceremony, most commonly on a holy day, the couple would return to a house or village, inexperienced, for meals, ale, dancing, and video games. The occasion could last for a number of days if harvest had been good. The union was greater than a personal bond. It was once a brand new monetary unit, and the village had a stake in its success. Normally, a ritual of bedding the bride happened. The place the couple was escorted to mattress with teasing and tune, symbolizing the starting of a fruitful household. Baptisms and christenings, new lifestyles, used to be normally a purpose for pleasure. After a baptism, family and neighbors gathered for bread, ale, and music. Godparents had been chosen, almost always close acquaintances or respected villagers, growing lifelong bonds. Funerals, though solemn, ended with a meal and shared remembrance. Demise was once a part of life, and peasants grieved collectively, quite often expressing sorrow via dirges, prayers, and folks' laments. Tune, dance, and pleasure party used to be incomplete without tune. Peasant instruments integrated the fiddle pipe and tabor, a small drum, the hurdy-gurdy whistles, flutes, and bagpipe stances were simple but vigorous circle dances, line dances, or companion reels. Songs informed studies of affection, conflict, saints, or satire. Some songs had been bardy, others sacred. Kids clapped. Historic females sang lullabies. Each festival had a soundtrack, and even the poorest peasant knew a tune or two. Dancing was a broach to have a good time, to flirt, to mourn, or to pray. In an age earlier than theatre or books, music and movement were the language of the individuals. Feast and famine. The role of food in occasion feasting used to be principal to social gathering. On feast days, households would slaughter a pig, bake wheat bread rather, of course, rye, or drink stronger ale. Cheese, eggs, honey, and rare fruits made appearances. If the village pooled assets, a communal stew or roasted ox might feed everyone. However, abundance was once not ever guaranteed. A foul harvest meant a lean feast. Even then, peasants celebrated with what they had: tune, prayer, and togetherness. The spirit of the feast survived even when food did not. Conclusion. Pleasure in the midst of rest. To be a peasant in the core ages was to undergo difficulty, but also to have a good time, life's joys, with passion and gratitude. Feasts and galas have been greater than diversions. They have been affirmations of hope, notion, and community. They reminded peasants that existence was once no longer only about work. However, about belonging to a village, a tradition, and a faith that carried them through darkness. In the glow of bonfires, the laughter of children, the rhythm of drums, and the solemn chant of mass, we find the soul of the medieval village, no longer in silence, but in tune. Now not in solitude, but in occasion. These have been the moments when the burdens of existence have been in short lifted, when peasants danced in bare feet on the grass, raised mugs to the sky, and seemed to the celebs, not with dread, however with surprise. To fully grasp the life of a medieval peasant, we have got to comprehend the sector they lived in, not just the bodily world of fields and villages, but the social method that shore them from beginning to loss of life. Feudalism. Feudalism used to be not just a political constitution, it was a tradition, an internet of duties and customs that defined who you had been, what you would do, and how you survived. On the heart of it stood a deeply hierarchical society, with the king at the high, the lords beneath, and the peasants, the substantial majority, on the very backside. But for the common peasant, probably the most robust figure wasn't the distant king or even the local bishop. It used to be their lord, and the manor they belonged to was once the stage on which their whole life performed out. In this chapter, we'll explore the structure of medieval feudal society, the position of the manor, the everyday duties that tied peasants to their lords, and the way this system shaped no longer best labor and wealth, however identification and freedom, what used to be feudalism. Feudalism was once a process developed on land, loyalty, and labor. It developed in Europe after the cave-in of centralized Roman authority, when safeguard grew to be essentially the most useful currency. On its simplest type, a king granted land to nobles, lords, barons, earls, in exchange for army help. These nobles granted portions of that land to knights or vassals, who promised to serve them in combat, and at the bottom of this pyramid had been the peasants, who worked the land in return for security and a place to a living. This wasn't a rigid structure like a corporation. It used to be individual, local, and deeply rooted in custom. A peasant would not ever travel greater than 10 miles from their village, but their labor, dues, and existence were shaped by way of the choices of lords and kings far away. The peasant's world. A manor was once greater than a gigantic house. It was an entire financial and social unit. A usual manor included a manor residence where the lord or his steward lived, a few villages or hamlets inhabited by means of peasants, fields divided into strips and circled by way of a three-field method, meadows, pasturelands and forests, a church, mill, blacksmith, and frequently a manorial court. The peasants' connection to the manor was once most likely lifelong and hereditary. They worked the land, paid dues, and in return they had the correct to farm specified strips and to receive protection from their lord. Some peasants were free tenants, however many might be the bulk have been serfs. Serfdom, born to serfs, weren't slaves. They might no longer be purchased or sold personally, but they weren't free. They have been bound to the land, and if the land changed palms, they went with it. A serf wanted permission to marry, move, or depart. The manor owed a portion of their produce and labor to the lord. Used to be, by and large, required to work the domain the lord's own land before tending to their possessed strips. Serfdom used to be no longer legally voluntary. Most have been born into it, but at the same time it should seem oppressive. It also offered defense, predictability, and community in any other case damaging and chaotic medieval world. Tasks, labor, rent, and feudal dues. Peasants' obligations to their lord got here in a couple of forms. Labor services. This used to be probably the most main obligation. Peasants were required to plow and sow the lord's fields, harvest the lord's crops, hold roads, fences, and constructions, furnish transportation utilizing their carts and oxen. Labor needs increased in the course of planting and harvest seasons, in mainly significant manors. These services might eat a number of days each week. Rents and taxes bind labor. Peasants owed a point for their houses and land, traditionally paid in grain, eggs, or chickens, an element of their harvest, too, as a tithe to the church, customarily 10%, fees for utilizing the lord's mill, bakery, or wine press. These had been often called banalities, a harriet or inheritance rate, upon the loss of life of a tenant. Even simple moves had a cost. Want to grind grain? Pay to make use of the mill. Want to brew ale on the market? Ask permission and pay a cost. In many places, even fishing in a regional stream or gathering timber within the forest was a privilege granted or denied. By means of the lord. Justice and the manorial courtroom lords held not simply financial energy, however judicial authority. Most legal concerns were dealt with within the manorial court, the place the lord or his steward presided over disputes. Offenses ranged from trampling crops or failing to maintain a fence, to theft, drunkenness, home disputes, or forget-about of obligations. Punishments could include fines, probably the most long-established, public shaming, pressured labor, or, in severe circumstances, physical punishment. For a peasant, the court docket was once each protector and oppressor. It enforced village norms, but in addition served the interests of the lord. The lord's lifestyles, authority, luxurious, and accountability. Lords were a long way wealthier. They weren't always absent. Many lived in manor residences near the village, notably in much less militarized areas. Others left management to a bailiff or steward, depended on administrator who oversaw the estate. Lords had the proper to collect dues, demand labor, put into effect justice, and avoid the movements of their peasants. In return, they were expected to defend the village from raiders or war, furnish entry to the church and priest, preserve infrastructure like roads and bridges. Lords have been also principal landowners and took part in regional politics. Their wealth got here not handiest from peasant labor, but from warfare booty, dowries, royal want, and alternate resistance and negotiation rigors of their position. Peasants were not continually passive. They negotiated their dues, petitioned the court, and on rare occasions rebelled. One of the most famous uprisings was the Peasants' Riot of 1381 in England, when 1000s marched on London to demand fairer legal guidelines, shrink taxes, and finished to though the rise up failed, it printed that peasants understood the procedure and sought alternate when pushed to a long way. Over time, monetary shifts like the Black Death weakened the grip of feudalism. With fewer workers, peasants could demand higher terms. Some bought their freedom. Others fled to cities. The system cracked, however, for the period of the excessive medieval period. It held corporation, faith, and feudal responsibility. The church reinforced the feudal order, instructing that kings ruled by using God's will, lords have been positioned above, peasants by divine order. Obedience and humility have been Christian virtues. Peasants have been taught that struggling in this lifestyles could be rewarded in the next. The process, though unfair by means of today's necessities, used to be noticeable as ordinary, even holy. This belief gave feudalism exotic staying power. It used to be no longer just an financial method, it was a religious framework, one where the peasant saw himself as a part of a grand divine chain of being. A day in the existence. Peasant and lord think. A summer season morning. The lords. Steward walks the domain, checking on the development of ploughing. Peasants work the fields, pausing to nod as he passes. A lady carries a basket of eggs to the manor condominium as part of her hire. A boy fetches water from the circulate for the bakehouse. The bell rings, calling villagers to a feast day mass. Within the afternoon, a courtroom hears disputes. One neighbor accuses a further of stealing firewood. The whole thing, the work, the foundations, the relationships is rooted in the manor. It's not just a position, it is the world. Conclusion. Sure, by using land, defined by means of obligation, the medieval peasant was once more than a farmer. They were a participant in a deeply structured society. Person who assigned that means to their labor and place to their person. Feudalism provided no upward mobility, no escape from labor, but it did present balance, identification, and a promise that if you happened to fulfill your duties, you could be protected, remembered, and probably even rewarded within the existence to return. The manor used to be no longer in simple terms, a workplace. It used to be a community, a court, a church, and a house. And although it stood on the backs of peasants, it additionally gave them a stage on which to live their brief, determined, and deeply rooted lives. Even as the snapshot of a medieval peasant customarily brings to intellect a farmer behind a plough or a lady tending farm animals, the truth of peasant labor used to be far extra various and dynamic. The peasant was once not, with no trouble, a cultivator of the land. He was once a builder, a craftsman, a gatherer, a dealer, and most often an inventor in his possessed right. The core ages noticed gradual but huge technological trade, in most cases driven no longer by scholars or kings, but by way of the everyday desires of common people. For peasants, innovation used to be born of necessity, and survival relied on craftsmanship as a lot as cultivation. Their world was once filled with instruments easy, but ingenious used, no longer best within the fields, but in addition within the forests, the workshops, and the residence. On this chapter, we discovered the tools of labor, the trades practiced in and around the village, and the applied sciences modest, however, transformative that formed medieval peasant lifestyles. Beyond the fields, a life of many labors, although agriculture remained the cornerstone of peasant survival. The common villager did rather more than plant and harvest. In the course of slower agricultural seasons, peasants engaged in a huge range of secondary duties, repairing fences, tools, carts, and roofs, spinning wool or weaving material, brewing ale or baking bread for sale or barter, crafting shoes, baskets, tools, or pottery. Some of these events had been casual, others evolved into well-known trades, practiced by way of expert participants within the peasant category, or somewhat above it. Even small villages had blacksmiths, carpenters, and millers, persons whose labor fashioned the spine of rural lifestyles. Primary tools of the peasant. World peasant tools have been crafted from wooden, iron, bone, and stone, built for durability and function. Though primitive by using contemporary requisites, they have been well suitable to their duties, and most likely handed down throughout generations. Agricultural instruments. Plough, ard, or heavy plough. The ard was a gentle scratch plough for shallow soils, whilst the heavy plough, pulled by means of oxen, was utilized in northern Europe to show thick, clay soil. The heavy plough's introduction dramatically accelerated yields in distinct areas. Sickle and scythe, used for cutting grain and grass. The sickle had a brief, curved blade, excellent for shut harvesting. The scythe, with a long control and sweeping blade, allowed one to mow enormous areas successfully. Harrow, a wooden frame with spikes, used to break up soil after ploughing. Flail, a handheld instrument for threshing, beating harvested grain to separate the seeds from the stalk. home tool squern stones, hand-powered grinding stones used to mill grain at dwelling. Though many lords required peasants to use and pay for the lord's mill, spindle and distaff used for spinning wool or flax into thread. Most peasant females had been well-practiced spinners, knives, shears, and simple iron pots. These had been normal in each family, and ordinarily shared amongst neighbors. Construction instruments, adze and axe, for cutting and shaping wooden, hammer and chisel, used in stone and timber building, auger, a hand drill used to make holes in trees for construction. Each software had to be maintained, repaired, and valued. Many peasants made their own tools or relied on the village blacksmith and principal figure in rural life. Craftsmen inside the village. Thou, craftsmen could conjure photos of guilds and cities. Many rural peasants were expert artisans, creating goods for nearby use or modest alternate. The blacksmith of every village needed as a minimum one smith. He shod horses, repaired plowshares, sharpened blades, and crafted nails, hinges, locks, and different most important metalwork. His forge was once the engine of the village's infrastructure, and his ability was revered. Although he remained part of the lower class, the chippy wooden was once all over walls, carts, wheels, tools, furnishings. The chippy built homes, repaired wagons, and helped construct mills, barns, and bridges. The miller. Most villages had a grain mill, commonly water-powered. Peasants brought their grain here, paying a portion to the lord and the miller. Mills have been hubs of recreation and innovation, and millers have been each wanted and on the whole quietly resented for the dues they accumulated. The tanner and shomer Curlythor was principal for shoes, belts, luggage, and harnesses. The tanner changed animal hides into usable fabric, a pungent and demanding job. The cobbler then turned that leather based into boots and apparel. The weaver peasant females spun wool or flax. However, official weavers created material on bigger looms. In some villages, weaving was a cottage enterprise, with entire households worried in creation. Peasant innovation and technological ingenuity. Medieval innovation is normally related to monks, students, or engineers. Peasants additionally drove and tailored new technologies, the 3D system earlier than the 9th century. Most peasants used a two-subject system, one area planted, the other fallow. But the three-discipline method revolutionized agriculture. One field with wintry weather crops, wheat or rye. One with spring plants, oats, barley, legumes. One left fallow to recuperate. This allowed for more steady yields, higher soil fertility, and a different eating regimen, contributing to populous progress across Europe. Watermills and windmills were invented earlier. Via the high center a while, watermills had ended up popular. These powered grain mills, fulling mills for cloth construction. Sawmills. In windy areas, windmills started appearing as well, mainly in the Low Countries. These allowed peasants to procedure grain faster and with less guide labor. Horse collar. An iron plowshare. The horse collar allowed horses, which are rapid than oxen, for use for plowing without choking them. Mixed with the iron plowshare, this made plowing more effective and helped open up new lands for cultivation. These may just appear like small changes, however, that they had giant ripple effects, permitting peasants to farm extra land, produce more meals, and sustain better communities. Trade, barter, and rural markets. Even peasants, who weren't full-time craftsmen, engaged in barter and trade. A loved ones would promote surplus grain at a nearby market, exchange wool yarn for pottery, offer cheese or eggs in alternate for shoes or material. Local markets, and galas as a rule, held weekly or monthly, introduced collectively peasants, traders, and retailers from neighborhood villages and cities. Right here, peasants glimpsed the broader world, imported items, special spices, foreign coins, and information from faraway lands. Some enterprising peasants developed small-scale companies, alewives, women who brewed ale for sale, dyers who colored wool and linen with ordinary pigments, midwives who had been paid for attending births, herbalists who prepared cures, whilst most remained tied to the land. Some started out to specialize, main to the slow emergence of a rural center type, studying by using, doing, generational craftsmanship. The potential of those trades and instruments wasn't written in books. It was handed down from mother or father to little one, shared by way of fingers-on instructing and cautious commentary. A boy might watch his father forge iron for years before selecting up the hammer himself. A woman could learn to weave via carding wool at age 6, spinning via 8, and managing a loom through 12. Apprenticeship was once more commonly informal in villages, however no less rigorous. The exceptional craftsmen within the village had been revered, their knowledge preserved like treasure, and, when disaster struck, they have been the first known as to rebuild. The position of women in peasant enterprise, even as men more often than not took on heavier labor or public trades. Ladies were fiscal engines of their own right. Their roles included spinning, weaving and stitching clothing, baking, brewing and dairying, gathering herbs for treatment and dye, elevating chicken and managing kitchen gardens. In some instances, women took over their husbands' trades after loss of life or ran corporations of their possessed names. Alewives, midwives, and spinners had been customary in every community. Their labor was once rarely recorded, but it surely used to be most important to the household and village economy. The boundaries of technology, regardless of their ingenuity, peasants lived with consistent constraints. Iron was once high-priced. Many tools had wooden components and broke easily. Mills and forges have been managed with the aid of lords, who charged for his or her use. Innovation used to be restrained by time. Survival left little room for experimentation. Still, the instruments they used and elevated allowed them to form forests, dig canals, plant fields, and lift homes. Their ingenuity carved civilization out of barren region. Conclusion: the craft behind survival. The medieval peasant was greater than an employee of soil. He was once a carver of wood, a mender of instruments, a builder of partitions, a spinner of thread, and a barterer of goods. She was a brewer, a baker, a healer, and a keeper of secret potential passed down for generations. They would possibly not were scholars or inventors in the modern experience. However, they formed their world with cleverness, adaptation, and selection. The tools they used, the trades they practiced, and the small improvements they adopted formed the unseen engine of medieval life. In the whisper of the spinning wheel, the clang of hammer on anvil, and the rumble of a turning millstone, we hear now not just the noise of labor, but the heartbeat of a civilization constructed by way of fingers that not ever stopped working. The medieval peasants' lifestyles was once inseparable from household and community. For peasants, household was now not only a social unit, it was the basis of survival, labor, identification, and lifestyle. The household used to be the center of everyday existence, a position of work, relaxation, celebration, and sorrow. But peasant loved ones' lifestyles used to be complex and mainly rough. Marriage, childbearing, and kinship got here with joys and burdens alike. In a world, the place loss of life used to be ever gift, where labor was relentless and assets scarce. The household functioned as a unit of monetary cooperation, social support, and emotional refuge. In this chapter, we delve into the rhythms of peasant family existence, exploring marriage customs, the roles of guys and ladies, childhood and inheritance, and the net of ties that held the village collectively. The peasant household, work, and refuge. Most peasants lived in small, simple houses, commonly a single room with a fire, a grime floor, and sparse fixtures. These houses sheltered nuclear households. Although improved kinship ties were close in principle, a natural household included the head of the family, most of the time the daddy or eldest male, his wife, their youngsters, oftentimes elderly loved ones or apprentices. Houses had been built from wattle and daub-woven wood strips plastered with clay and thatched with straw. Privateness was minimal. The whole loved ones slept, ate, and worked within the same house. Marriage, realistic and sacred marriage, used to be not often about romance on my own. It was a social contract with financial and communal implications. Age and consent. Most peasants married of their late young adults or early 20s. The church required consent from each parties, but parental influence and the Lord's approval normally weighed closely. Marriage used to be a serious, lifelong commitment, binding to families, to parcels of land, and to workforces. Divorce used to be infrequent and discouraged. The ceremony weddings were church affairs, involving exchange of vows, blessing by means of the priest, more commonly adopted by a village feast. The couple would additionally engage in regional customs, just like the bedding ritual, symbolizing fertility and the start of their loved ones. Gender roles and labor division. Men and ladies had unique but complementary roles. Men often dealt with fieldwork, plowing, sowing, harvesting, and animal husbandry. Women managed the house, prepared food, cared for kids, spun thread, tended gardens, and helped with lighter farm duties. Older kids, in particular girls, helped in home responsibilities. Boys learned farming expertise. Ladies had been also critical in making and repairing clothing, brewing ale, and mostly trading items. Youngsters' hope and hassle. Childhood was transient and fragile. Boy or girl mortality was once high and plenty. If children not ever reached adulthood, youngsters started out working at a younger age, learning advantage by means of looking at father and mother and siblings. Boys helped with animals and fieldwork. Women realized spinning, cooking, and childcare. Regardless of hardships, households cherished youngsters as each benefits and future staff. Inheritance and succession. Land used to be the lifeblood of the peasant loved ones, and inheritance was once relevant. Most peasants practiced partible inheritance, dividing land among all sons or primogeniture, passing land to the eldest son depending on local customized daughters in most cases. Bought smaller parts or dowries. Inheritance ensured household survival but also precipitated fragmentation of land over generations. Kinship and group ties. Peasant life improved beyond the nuclear loved ones. Multiplied kin networks furnished support throughout harvests, help in health problem, childcare, mutual security. Village lifestyles used to be communal. Neighbors shared instruments, labor, and celebrations. Disputes occurred, but cooperation was most important. Godparents, neighbors, and fellow tenants fashioned an internet of responsibility and friendship, making the village a living organism. Challenges, poverty, disorder, and mortality. Families faced many trials: famine, plague, conflict, harsh climate. Widows and orphans were prone. Improved households most often absorbed them, or the village offered aid. Marriage was also a survival method, guaranteeing labor, defense, and social steadiness. Love, courtship, and get-together. Despite practicalities, love and affection existed. Courtship would contain gifts, songs, or conferences at fairs and galas. Marriage feasts and baptisms had been occasions for joy and tune, strengthening community bonds. Conclusion: loved ones as basis for the medieval peasant. Family was the primary college, workplace, and sanctuary. Marriage, birth, loss of life, all were intertwined with group, faith, and survival. By way of seasons of complication and occasion, the household and village shaped a community of care and identity, guaranteeing that, even in a harsh world, human bonds endured. Within the difficult, unforgiving world of the medieval geographical region, meals was now not simply nourishment, it was once a subject of survival. The peasants' everyday foods were shaped by way of the seasons, the soil, the feudal dues owed to the lord, and the ever-gift hazard of famine or dangerous harvests. But, within these limits, peasants developed a cuisine that was once hearty, ingenious, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the land. On this chapter, we explore what medieval peasants ate and drank, how meals used to be ready, the position of animals and vegetation, and the communal rituals around the desk that brought families and villages together. Staples of the peasant diet. The medieval peasant weight loss plan used to be easy but diverse, with the aid of vicinity, season, and social reputation. The main staples: integrated grains. The bread of life grain was once the basis of the peasant's food regimen. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were grown in rotation, with the kind depending on local climate and soil. Bread used to be the everyday centerpiece. The poorest peasants ate black bread, produced from rye or barley, coarse and heavy. Wheat bread was rarer and extra expensive. Peasants mainly floored their grain on quern stones at residence or paid to make use of the lord's mill. Bread was once eaten at each meal, normally dipped in broth or wine. Pottage. The common stew, a thick savory stew called pottage, was once the peasant's most long-established dish. It combined something used to be available: grains, vegetables, beans, herbs, and now and again meat or fish. Pottage used to be cooked slowly in a giant pot over the fireplace. It was filling, nutritious, and adaptable. Peasants would add onions, leeks, cabbage, or wild herbs on infrequent events. Small bits of pork, mutton, or contemporary fish would taste it. Veggies and leguminous vegetables were vital to the food regimen. Cabbage, Onions, garlic, peas, beans, and lentils had been fashioned. Wild veggies and herbs have been gathered seasonally. Peasants grew root veggies like turnips and carrots as well. Legumes furnished essential protein and had been staple in the course of fasting durations when meat used to be forbidden. Meat, fish, and dairy. Occasional luxuries. Meat was once a luxurious for many peasants, eaten most effective on feast days or after successful hunts. Peasants raised pigs, chickens, and mostly sheep for meat, eggs, and wool. Searching was once in most cases reserved for nobles. Peasants might be punished for poaching. Fish, primarily salted or dried, used to be primary chiefly for the period of fasting days, when meat was prohibited with the aid of the church. Dairy products like milk, cheese, and butter have been normal and valuable. Food, education, and cooking used to be achieved over an open hearth or in a clay oven when on hand. Meals was boiled, roasted, or baked. Herbs and spices have been minimal and costly. Peasants quite often relied on local herbs for taste. Salt was useful, used sparingly for protection and seasoning. Cooking used to be most often a communal activity, with women gathering around the fire and youngsters serving too. Drink ale, water, and wine. Ale was once the everyday drink for peasants. Nutritious, relatively safe to drink, and calorie-rich. It was weaker than present-day beer, more commonly cloudy and brewed at residence or locally. Water was traditionally dangerous, so ale was the safer choice. In the course of specified events, wine possibly consumed, primarily in southern Europe. Cider and mead have been additionally enjoyed where available. Feasting and fasting. Religious influences on weight loss. Church widely influenced medieval consuming habits. Fasting days required peasants to abstain from meat, eggs, and dairy. Lent and Advent had been primarily strict, with peasants counting on fish, legumes, and veggies. Feast days had been occasions for indulgence. Meat, sweetbreads, and ale flowed freely. Maintenance and storage without refrigeration. Peasants used a number of methods to preserve meals: drying and smoking meat and fish, salting meat and fish, fermentation of dairy into cheese and butter, storage in cool cellars or pits. Protection used to be important to survive iciness and lean occasions. Communal consuming and social rituals. Meals were quite often shared communally, notably in the course of fairs or after harvest. The family gathered around a central hearth. Food used to be served in large bowls or trencher. Stale bread used as plates. Sharing was once an emblem of group and survival. Food shortage and famine. Regardless of the high efforts, peasants in general faced food shortages. Crop screw-ups due to weather, pests, or struggle led to famine. Malnutrition weakened villagers and made them prone to sickness. The high-quality famine 1315-1317 devastated Europe, killing hundreds of thousands. Conclusion: the peasant's table as a mirror of their world. The medieval peasant's food plan was a mirrored image of their environment, social constitution, and beliefs. A daily negotiation between shortage and a lot, toil and occasion. At their easy desk, peasants located nourishment, relief, and neighborhood, weaving the material of their lives one meal at a time. And the medieval nation-state existence used to be harsh, and well-being used to be precarious. Disease, injury, and malnutrition have been customary, and scientific knowledge was confined. In most cases a combo of old knowledge, religious notion, and folks' remedies. For peasants, therapy was once a consistent problem: how to outlive illness, with scarce assets and unsure remedies. This chapter explores the state of well-being, customary diseases, medical practices, and therapy traditions in the day-to-day lifetime of a medieval peasant. It displays how peasants coped with struggling and sought remedy in an international without modern-day treatment. The reality of medieval wellness. Medieval peasants lived in close contact with nature, animals, and each different stipulations ripe for the unfold of sickness. Negative sanitation, contaminated water, and overcrowded properties made infections long established. Fashioned well-being issues integrated respiratory ailments, reminiscent of pneumonia and tuberculosis, digestive disorders, more commonly linked to negative weight reduction plan or spoiled meals, parasites like lice and worms, accidents from farm work cuts, broken bones, infections, childbirth issues, an important intent of death among women, plagues and epidemics, such because the Black Death, which devastated Europe within the 14th century. Lifestyle's expectancy was low. Many peasants died before age 40, but those who survived childhood might are living into their 50s or beyond. Clinical capabilities and beliefs. Medieval remedy was once a patchwork of historic Greek and Roman texts, peculiarly Galen and Hippocrates. Religious teachings, emphasizing prayer and divine will. People remedies and natural potential passed by means of generations. The body was once understood by means of the thought of humus blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health intended balance. Illness was once imbalance. Treatment practices and cures. Peasants had restricted entry to informed physicians, who have been luxurious and usually determined most effective in cities or monasteries. As an alternative, they relied on regional healers, and shrewd ladies referred to as herbalists, midwives, or cunning people, used herbs, poultices, charms, and prayers, dealt with wounds, fevers, childbirth, and long-established illnesses. Herbs and crops ordinarily used. Medicinal vegetation included willow bark, natural painkiller, chamomile calming and digestive support, garlic antimicrobial, nettles, nutrient-wealthy and for blood purification, lavender and mint for digestion and complications. Devout cures and rituals. Religion performed a principal position in cure. Prayers and pilgrimages to shrines of saints have been common. Holy water, relics, and blessings have been believed to remedy or defend. Illness used to be generally noticeable as punishment for sin, so confession and penance were a part of remedy. Surgical procedure and medical technique. Surgical procedure was infrequent and risky, normally carried out with the aid of barbers or traveling healers. Usual strategies incorporated bloodletting to restore humor, balance, elimination of boils or abscesses, setting damaged bones with splints, without antiseptics. Infection after surgery used to be a essential threat. Vitamin and well-being. Bad weight loss plan weakened peasants, making them vulnerable to disorder. Lack of vitamins resulted in stipulations like scurvy. Protein shortages affected growth and force. Periodic famines compounded well-being problems. Group care and support. Village communities cared for the ill by way of delivering food and tending fires, aiding with chores for the period of health problem, sharing advantage of treatments. This mutual help used to be valuable to survival. The affect of epidemics. The Black Demise 1347-1351 killed an estimated one-third of Europe's populace. It induced trendy worry and social upheaval. Labor shortages after the plague extended stipulations for surviving peasants, ultimately weakening feudal bonds. Conclusion: survival through religion, abilities, and group. The medieval peasants' well-being was fragile. However, their response mixed sensible cures, faith, and communal care. In an international without hospitals or brand new remedy, survival was once a triumph of resilience, tradition, and hope. Because the medieval generation drew to a close, the sector of the peasant was once getting ready to transformation. The rigid buildings of feudalism commenced to loosen, new financial forces emerged, and the everyday lifetime of peasants slowly converted, paving the way in which for the ultra-modern age. This chapter displays on the legacy of medieval peasants, how their lives influenced history, culture, and society, and the profound alterations that commenced to reshape rural Europe in the late, middle, a long time and past. The enduring legacy of peasant life, although most likely lost sight of by common history. Medieval peasants were the basis of European civilization. Their labor sustained kingdoms, developed economies, and created communities that persevered for centuries. The peasant culture contributed to agricultural innovations that boosted productiveness, the development of neighborhood markets and trade networks, the persistence of people, traditions, crafts, and potential, social customs and group bonds that influence rural life even in these days. The decline of feudalism and the upward thrust of latest forces. A couple of causes resulted in the decline of the medieval peasants' average world. The black loss of life decimated populations, causing labor shortages. Surviving peasants won bargaining vigor, demanding higher wages and stipulations. Lords commenced to hire land for cash as an alternative of labor dues. The upward thrust of cities and cities furnished new financial possibilities. Alterations in land possession and inheritance blurred historic feudal traces. These shifts eroded the strict hierarchies that had bound peasants to the land and lord. Peasants and social trade peasants were not passive victims of historical past. They engaged in rebellions and revolts, stressful rights and comfort from oppression, moved to towns to search freedom and new livelihoods. Tailored agricultural practices to new financial realities, maintained traditions that enriched European culture. Their resilience formed the transition from medieval to early today's Europe. Cultural and folks traditions, many customs, fairs, and people arts have roots in peasant existence. Seasonal celebrations like Good Day and harvest galas, folks tune dance, and storytelling traditions, crafts comparable to weaving, pottery, and blacksmithing, passed by means of generations. These cultural legacies offer a window into the medieval peasant's worldview and values. The peasant in literature and reminiscence. Medieval peasants appear in chronicles, songs, and later literature, regularly idealized, usually disparaged. They symbolize rough work, humility, and endurance. They're also reminders of social inequality and struggle. State of the art. Historians have sought to get their voices and experiences. The transformation of rural life by way of the Renaissance. Changes accelerated. Enclosure movements consolidated fields, displacing many peasants. Agricultural improvements, just like the heavy plow, crop rotation, and selective breeding, increased yields. Market economies multiplied. Decreasing subsistence, farming, schooling, and literacy slowly unfold, changing rural society. But many peasant villages retained echoes of medieval lifestyles well into the cutting-edge technology. Classes from the medieval peasant. The story of the medieval peasant teaches us about human resilience within the face of hardship, the importance of community and cooperation, the interplay of social methods, labor, and culture, how ordinary people form historical past by way of their day-to-day lives. Conclusion. Honoring the unsung backbone of history, the medieval peasant's existence was once hard, restrained, and by and large precarious. However, it used to be additionally rich in community, way of life, and that means their work constructed the foundations of contemporary Europe. Their struggles spurred social exchange. Their legacy lives on in the land they tended, the customs they preserved, and the reports they left at the back of. As we look back, we honor these numerous contributors, the silent majority of historical past whose everyday lives formed the world we inherit today.